He hadn't spoken to another soul in 31 days. The forest knew that. It had grown used to his silence. The birds returned slower now. The squirrels paused longer on the branches. Clint Harrison had carved himself into the stillness, grief turning to routine, routine turning to stone, until one morning, just past dawn, something broke the pact. From the mist, limping and bloodied, came a mother bobcat. She did not flee. She did not growl. She cried. And Clint, once a ranger, now a ghost among trees, watched as she laid her kittens at his feet, her body shaking, her eyes begging, not for food, not for shelter, for mercy. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments, and if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move, you please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The morning mist drifted like breath from the earth in the redwood forests of Northern California. Near the edge of Prairie Bend, a forgotten town no larger than a whisper on most maps, fog clung to the towering trees, wrapping the trunks in a silence both ancient and sacred. It was late October, and though the sun would eventually burn through the haze, for now, everything felt suspended, as if time itself were holding its breath. Clint Harrison stood on his porch, a steaming tin mug of black coffee in his calloused hands. At 58, Clint looked every bit the part of a man who had once belonged to the world but had long since turned away from it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a sun-worn complexion and a grizzled beard that had turned mostly gray. His denim jacket was patched at the elbows, his flannel shirt frayed at the collar. His boots, worn smooth by the forest floor, were more part of his body than his clothes. A former park ranger, Clint had spent the last 12 years living alone in a hand-built cabin a few miles outside town. After a devastating wildfire took the life of his younger brother, also a ranger, Clint had retreated deep into the woods, his grief hardening into a silence few dared to breach. He still guided the occasional visitor on hikes, and he carved furniture for the local shop. But mostly, he kept to himself and to the forest. That morning, he had set out early to check the water line along the creek that curved around his land. As he moved through the mossy underbrush, boots crunching damp leaves, the forest began to stir. Jays scolded from high limbs. A squirrel darted across his path, and then quiet. Not silence. Stillness. That was when he saw her, near the edge of a clearing, barely 20 feet ahead. Stood a female bobcat. Her coat, a blend of tawny gold and ash gray, was marked with faint black spots. Her tufted ears swiveled toward him, her eyes pale green and bright with pain locked onto his. She limped, favoring her right hind leg, which was matted with dried blood and tucked unnaturally beneath her. But it wasn't just her. From the brush behind her, two tiny shapes tumbled forward, kittens no more than 8 weeks old, one bolder, one smaller and timid, their coats mirroring their mother's in pattern. If not yet in solemn wisdom, Clint froze, not from fear, from awe. He had seen bobcats before, fleeting glimpses through leaves or across distant hillsides, but this was different. The mother did not flee. She stood her ground, and then, with a low, strange sound, half chirp, half cry, she called out, not in threat, not in anger, but in something raw, something closer to trust. "What in God's name?" Clint whispered. He lowered himself slowly, squatting on his heels, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're hurt, and you came to me." The bobcat limped forward, stopping just a few yards from where he knelt. Her kittens hesitated, mewling softly. The sound the mother made again, it was like nothing Clint had ever heard from a wild animal. A plea wrapped in wild instinct. Without thinking, Clint spoke aloud. "All right, girl, you win. Let's see what we can do. Back at his property. A small tool shed sat just beyond the cabin wooden, weather-stained, with a metal roof that clicked in the cold. Clint rarely used it now, aside from storing deer corn and traps for wayward raccoons. But it was warm, dry, and secure, with slow steps and frequent pauses. Clint led the limping bobcat and her kittens down the narrow trail. Each time he glanced back, the mother watched him, unblinking, at one point. The smaller kitten let out a wheezing cough that made Clint's stomach twist. He reached the shed and pulled the door open. Inside. He spread out a folded wool blanket in the corner, placed a shallow bowl of water, and laid out 2 pieces of venison jerky he had brought back from his last hunting trip. Then he stepped back. The bobcat sniffed the air, examined the doorway, and, after several moments, limped inside. Her kittens scurried after her, one tripping over a rake handle and squeaking indignantly. Clint let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding and slowly pulled the door shut, leaving it cracked. Just in case, inside the cabin. Clint sat heavily on the wooden bench by the fireplace. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the phone, an old rotary model that still worked when the cell signal failed. He stared at it for a long moment before dialing a number he hadn't used in over a year. The voice that answered was firm, a little sleepy, but clear. Dr. Marin Blake. Clint hesitated. Then Marin. It's Clint. There was a long pause. Well, hell just got a snowstorm. Marin Blake was 46, tall and willowy, with auburn hair streaked in silver. Her face was sharp, intelligent cheekbones like a hawk, eyes like wet shale, a veterinarian by training. She had returned to Prairie Bend 5 years earlier after a burnout from corporate vet work in Los Angeles. The pace of city trauma cases had left her brittle, until one day, she'd packed up and driven north. She was known in town for being blunt but deeply competent. She stitched up farm dogs and mountain lions alike, and when she wasn't treating animals. She volunteered at the County Wildlife Rehab Center. Marin and Clint had been close once years ago, before tragedy and silence grew between them. But Clint had never stopped remembering the warmth of her laugh, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. "What is it?" "Clint," she asked now, her voice softer. I've got a situation," he said. "A bobcat, injured, nursing 2 young ones." More silence. Then alive. "Yes." "Shot in the leg. Limping bad. She brought them to me, like she chose me. I'll be there in an hour." The line went dead. Clint leaned back, eyes closed, the firelight flickering against the worn walls of the cabin. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, somewhere deep in the trees. A hawk cried out, and in the tool shed at the edge of the clearing. Something wild had decided, for reasons only it knew, that Clint Harrison was worthy of its trust. The hum of tires on gravel was the only sound that broke the morning stillness. Clint stood in the misty clearing beside his cabin, arms crossed, waiting. The fog hadn't yet lifted from the redwoods, and dew clung to the worn wood of the tool shed where the bobcat mother and her kittens were sheltering. The air was tinged with the scent of cedar and rain-soaked earth, and Clint's jaw tightened as headlights cut through the pale gray veil. A dark blue Subaru pulled up slowly, coming to a stop in front of the cabin. Marin Blake stepped out, her tall frame wrapped in a green field jacket, hiking boots mud-stained from use. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a low braid, and thin lines framed her sharp, intelligent eyes that had seen too much and learned to remain still when the world trembled. She didn't smile. Neither did Clint. "Where is she?" Marin asked, voice low and even. Clint nodded toward the shed. "Inside. Been in there since yesterday." Marin grabbed her worn black vet bag from the back seat, then followed him without another word. The interior of the tool shed was dim, lit only by what light crept in through the cracked open door. The bobcat lay curled in the far corner, her body a blend of shadow and gold. Her right hind leg was stretched awkwardly, and when she saw Marin, her ears pinned back, but she didn't growl. The two kittens were pressed against her belly. One, larger and curious, lifted its head. The other lay stiller, breathing too hard for such a tiny chest. Marin crouched at the doorway, eyes narrowing. She's watching us, but she's not aggressive. That's good. I haven't touched her. I didn't want to push it. Smart. She opened her bag and pulled out a small flashlight. I need a better look at the wound, if she lets me. Clint fetched a slab of venison from the fridge and placed it just inside the shed. The bobcat's eyes followed his movements, but she didn't rise. Let me try something, Marin said, reaching into a side pocket and pulling out a small bottle filled with liquid, mild sedative. Oral. I'll mix it in with the meat. Clint nodded. She wouldn't eat anything yesterday until I left completely. I'll wait. They retreated back to the porch. Marin poured herself coffee from the thermos Clint offered, though she didn't say, thank you. It wasn't bitterness between them, it was weight. The years hadn't softened them, they had calcified separately. You still hate the phone, she said finally. I only use it when it's serious. And this is serious. They sat in silence, watching the shed from a distance. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, they saw her stir. The bobcat limped to the bowl, sniffed, then slowly ate. Marin stood. Let's go. Inside the shed. The sedative had taken mild effect. The bobcat blinked more slowly, her body less tense. Marin moved with deliberate calm. Kneeling just outside reach, Clint stayed back. Talk to her, she said quietly. About what doesn't matter. Just your voice. She knows you. Clint cleared his throat, then spoke low and steady. You did good, bringing them here. You're tougher than most humans I know. We're going to fix that leg of yours. All right. The bobcat blinked again. Not hostile. Marin leaned forward, examining the wound. Gunshot. .22 caliber. I'd bet entry and exit. Clean enough, but it fractured the tibia. That leg's not going to support her for a while. She'll heal with help. And time. Marin's hands moved with practiced precision, cleaning the wound, applying disinfectant, and finally wrapping the leg in a lightweight splint. The bobcat let out a low, uncertain whine but didn't lash out. Then Marin's eyes flicked to the kittens. She's got 2. Yeah. The bigger one's been bouncing around since yesterday, but the little one. Marin moved gently, reaching toward the smaller cub. It didn't resist as she lifted it. Its ribs fluttered under her fingertips, breath shallow and fast. This one's sick, likely congenital. Heart sounds irregular, weak lungs. She wouldn't have made it without her mother. She still might not. Clint's throat tightened. What can we do? Intensive care? Supplements? Maybe formula, if it'll take it, but it won't survive out here. She looked at Clint directly. If you want to save this one, you'll need to bring it inside. With you. He stared down at the trembling body in Marin's hands. I haven't had anything living in that cabin with me in a decade. Marin arched a brow. Then it's time. They brought the kitten inside, wrapped in a towel. Marin mixed a formula in a small bottle and coaxed the cub to suckle, gently but firmly. Clint watched, hands clenched. You've changed, Marin said softly. I didn't mean to. No one does. She handed him the bottle. You'll have to do this every 4 hours, day and night. I'll leave what you need. He nodded, awkward with the bundle in his lap. As the afternoon light faded, Clint walked Marin back to her car. Marin, he said. She paused at the door. I'm glad it was you I called. She studied him for a moment. I am too. She drove away. and Clint turned back toward the cabin, where a wild creature now lay curled beside his fire. Later that night, Clint stepped outside to check the shed one last time. The mother bobcat was resting, her good leg tucked beneath her. She looked up as he approached but did not stir. Then he saw it just beyond the tree line. Near the edge of the creek, a metal snare half hidden under a pile of leaves. Fresh, still open. His chest tightened. He stepped closer. Not old. Recently placed. He crouched, brushing back pine needles. There were others, small markings, faint boot prints, and the unmistakable chemical scent of bait. Someone had been hunting. And not for food. He stood slowly, the forest suddenly feeling less like home and more like something being watched. The fire crackled low in the hearth, sending shifting shadows across the cabin walls. Clint Harrison sat cross-legged on the wooden floor beside the hearth, a soft towel cradled in his lap. Inside it, nestled in warmth, Birch, the smaller bobcat kitten, lay curled, her breathing shallow but steady. The heat of the fire bathed them both in amber light, and the quiet that filled the cabin felt sacred. Outside, the redwoods loomed in silence, the mist finally thinning with the arrival of early November sunlight. It had been 5 days since Marin left him with the fragile creature. 5 days of round-the-clock feedings, antibiotic drops, and whispered encouragement. Clint kept his notes in a battered notebook mealtimes, dosage records, Birch's strength, or lack thereof. He hadn't cared for another living thing in a decade, but this small, spotted life had found a way through the barricades he'd spent years building, each morning, just before dawn. Shadow the mother bobcat would appear outside the cabin, as if summoned by some unspoken agreement. She would sit just beyond the porch, yellow-green eyes locked on the window. Clint would open the door slowly, holding Birch wrapped in a towel. Shadow never moved aggressively. Instead, she would approach with a soft chirp, nuzzle the kitten gently, and let out a sound like a sigh before returning to the forest. Birch would stir faintly at the scent of her mother, let out a weak purr, then nestled deeper into Clint's arms. Clint had begun talking aloud again, mostly to Birch, but sometimes to the walls, the fire, the wind. He spoke of the days he'd spent hiking Glacier Ridge with his brother, of how he used to track elk in silence just for the thrill of their nearness. He spoke of Marin, of how he still remembered the look in her eyes the night she left for Los Angeles. That morning, Marin arrived again. No warning, just the sound of her Subaru's tires crunching gravel and the brisk knock on the cabin door. "Still alive?" she asked, stepping inside, hands tucked in her jacket pockets. Her tone was half teasing, half hopeful. "Both of us." Clint answered, gesturing toward Birch by the hearth. Marin knelt by the fire, lifting Birch carefully and examining her with the practiced grace of someone who had tended both agony and hope. "She's holding on," she said. "Might even be a little stronger. I think she recognizes her mother's scent," Clint said. "Every time Shadow comes. She stirs a little. She still visits, like clockwork." Marin gave a soft, rare smile. "That's extraordinary." They shared coffee at the old oak table, its surface scarred with years of use, for a long time. They didn't speak. The comfort of shared silence had once been the strongest part of their relationship. And somehow, it returned now like an old rhythm neither had forgotten. "You still have that photo," she said, gesturing toward the mantel. "There." A dusty frame held an image of Clint and his brother, both in ranger uniforms, grinning beside a freshly built trail sign. "I never took it down." "You never take anything down." "Clint, you just let it sit." He nodded slowly. "I've been sitting with it for years. Birch, she's the first thing I've let in since he died." Before Marin could answer, Clint's voice dropped to a murmur. There's something else. He stood and retrieved a small canvas pouch from the counter. Inside were several clear images photographs printed from a trail camera. Clint laid them out on the table, a boot print near the creek, a baited snare hidden in moss, and the glint of what looked like a metal box lodged between rocks. A closer photo showed the edge of a small, camouflaged camera pointing toward a game trail. I found the first snare 5 days ago, Clint said. Then the camera. Yesterday I traced the path along the creek. Someone's been watching. Marin leaned in, her eyes narrowing. Illegally. No doubt, no tags, no signs, just equipment hidden in ways that say they didn't want anyone to find it. You report it yet. I wanted more evidence first, enough to make them act. They both knew the rangers in the county were stretched thin, covering too much land with too few people, unless someone got hurt. Or there was solid proof. Reports went uninvestigated for weeks. Marin exhaled. I can reach out to Travis. He used to work with the Fish and Wildlife Unit. Might be able to accelerate things. Do it quietly, Clint said. I don't want this spooking them. Whoever's doing this knows how to move through the forest. Marin nodded, then reached over and gently squeezed Clint's wrist. We'll get them, but don't let it pull you too deep. That kitten needs you clear-headed. That night, Clint moved Birch's bedding a little closer to the fireplace and left the porch light off. Around midnight, he heard the soft crunch of paws outside the door. He stepped out, holding Birch close to his chest. Shadow stood a few feet away, still and regal. Behind her, the other kitten, Luna. Clint had taken to calling her, sat obediently, watching. Shadow approached slowly, nosed Birch's tiny head, and let out a quiet rumble. Birch responded with a faint sound that stirred something aching in Clint's chest. Then Shadow looked up at him. And for a moment, just a moment, Clint thought she understood. Not as an animal, not as something wild, but as a mother, watching another creature keep her child alive. After she vanished back into the woods, Clint closed the door and sat by the fire again, Birch asleep in his lap. The room smelled of wood smoke and pine. Outside, the forest was no longer just home. It was a place of secrets and threats, of trust and danger. Clint wasn't sure which way the story was going yet, but for now, in the hush of his wooden cabin, he held on to a life smaller than his hand, and for the first time in years, he hoped the air was thick with the breath of the redwoods. As November settled fully over the Northern California forest, the days had shortened into quicksilver twilights, and the mornings came with frost clinging to pine needles like brittle lace. Clint Harrison moved slowly along the trail near Stony Creek, a camera slung over his shoulder and a pair of weathered leather gloves stuffed in his back pocket. His breath misted in front of him as he ducked beneath low limbs, eyes sweeping the mossy ground for signs. Birch had grown weaker overnight. Her breathing, once a gentle rise and fall, had become labored, shallow. Clint had fed her carefully that morning with a syringe, coaxing down a dose of antibiotics and a few drops of vitamin-rich formula, but her strength was fading. Even Marin, in her last visit 2 days ago, had said nothing hopeful, just that some things you fight even when you know you'll lose. But today, Clint wasn't by the hearth. Today, he was tracking a lead. The creekside trail had shown signs of increased human activity, fresh boot prints, broken twigs, a candy wrapper left carelessly beneath a rock. Clint had followed the signs for over an hour, and the forest had responded. It had gone still. Not silent still. The kind of stillness that made every breath louder, every movement deliberate. He reached a small clearing where deer paths crossed in a worn ring. There, half hidden beneath a fallen log, was another snare tight. Rusted wire baited with sardine oil. Clint crouched to photograph it. As he adjusted his camera's lens, A sharp rattle broke the quiet. The sound hit his ears like a switchblade. To his right, coiled beneath a sun-warmed rock, was a timber rattlesnake, large, old, its body the color of dried leaves and dust. The rattle buzzed again, louder this time closer. Clint froze. The snake's head rose, tongue flickering, its thick body tensing for a strike. He was too far from his rifle, which leaned uselessly against a tree 10 feet back. His knife was at his hip, but he knew the range too well he wouldn't be fast enough. Slowly, Clint began to back away, one cautious step at a time. His boot caught on a gnarled root. He stumbled. The snake surged forward, fangs exposed, body coiling in a violent whip of motion. And then, something golden and wild flashed into view. A streak of fur slammed into the rattlesnake mid-lunge. It was Shadow. Her body struck the serpent with brutal force, sending it tumbling back into the brush in the same breath. Another blur joined her Luna, her daughter, now nearly full-grown, her coat sleeker and brighter, her paws striking with uncanny precision. The two bobcats moved as if they'd trained for this moment. Shadow sank her teeth behind the rattler's skull, Luna slashing from the side with claws sharp as broken glass. The snake twisted violently, hissing, coils striking the dirt. But it was too late. Within seconds, it lay motionless. Clint hadn't moved. His heart pounded, not just from the narrow escape, but from the surreal clarity of what had happened. Shadow released the dead snake and backed away, chest heaving, fur bristled but eyes calm. She turned to Clint, her yellow-green gaze holding his. He dropped to a knee. You saved my life." Luna approached cautiously, stopping a few feet from him, her body low but unafraid. She glanced toward her mother, then toward the baited snare Clint had been photographing, and then, in a motion too human to dismiss. Shadow turned her head, directing her gaze not at Clint but at the trap. Clint followed her line of sight. The message was clear. He stood slowly, retrieved his camera, and took several more photographs of the snare, of the surrounding area, of the snake's body with the bobcats sitting nearby. Sentinel-like. The forest had answered. And now it was his turn, by the time he made it back to the cabin. Dusk had begun to settle like a wool blanket. Birch was still alive barely. He warmed her formula, administered the medicine, and placed her in her towel near the fire. Then he picked up the phone. The man who answered was Travis Denton, a fish and wildlife officer in his mid-40s with a stocky frame, sun-creased skin, and a voice like a gravel road. Travis had once served with Clint's younger brother. Back when both had been rangers on the North Rim, he was dependable, quiet, and practical to a fault. Clint got straight to the point. "I've got evidence, photos, snares, cameras, and a poacher trail heading toward Raven's Hollow." There was a pause on the line. Then Travis said, "I'll call in a state unit. Been waiting for a solid tip. You just gave it." 2 days later, the arrests came. 3 men, all from out of state, were found camping deep in the reserve with high-powered rifles, poison bait, and coolers full of illegally taken animal parts bobcat pelts, bear gallbladders, and even a satchel marked with hawk feathers and teeth. Clint's photographs had provided the final link, and the trail cam he recovered on his last walk sealed the case. When Travis called to confirm, his voice carried a rare note of satisfaction. "You did right. Clint, you saved more than yourself this week." Clint stood by the fire, the phone still in his hand, the weight of everything pressing into his shoulders. Behind him, Birch stirred faintly in her sleep. He turned just in time to see the flicker of movement outside the window. Shadow. She stood at the tree line, watching as always, beside her. Luna. They had returned again, maybe to check on Birch, maybe just to witness. Clint stepped onto the porch. "It's done," he said aloud, unsure whether he spoke to the bobcats or the trees. "They're gone." Shadow blinked slowly. Her ears twitched forward. Then, without a sound, she turned and vanished into the forest. Luna close behind her. Clint remained in the doorway long after they'd disappeared, the wind rustling the tall ferns, the smoke from the chimney curling into the sky. The forest had answered, and he had listened. The first snowfall came early that year, dusting the redwoods in a thin layer of white that melted slowly beneath the branches' thick, evergreen crowns. Clint Harrison stood beside the base of an ancient red oak, the largest on his land, gnarled and wide, its roots rising like knotted fingers above the forest floor. Beneath that tree, wrapped in the soft flannel of an old ranger's shirt, lay Birch. The little bobcat hadn't made it through the night. For days. Her breathing had grown weaker despite Clint's near-constant care. Her body had grown too light in his arms, her bones too prominent beneath her dappled fur. Marn had come once more, tried new medications, new feeding techniques, but it had only delayed the inevitable. Clint had held her as the fire dimmed and the first flakes of snow kissed the cabin windows. She passed quietly, curled in his palms, the faintest vibration of life fading into silence. He hadn't cried not until he wrapped her, not until he stepped into the woods that morning to lay her down where the wild had first begun to trust him. Shadow watched from a distance as he covered the small grave with pine needles and soft earth. Her eyes, still alert, shimmered with a knowing Clint could never fully explain. She didn't come closer. She didn't need to. Luna, now nearly as large as her mother, paced quietly nearby, her steps more confident, her frame more muscular. She circled the burial ground once, then sat beside a moss-covered stump and stared at the mound. Clint felt something shift in his chest, not grief alone, but a kind of recognition, as if the forest itself acknowledged the loss. Days passed slowly. Clint's routine settled back into their quiet rhythms, chopping wood, mending fence lines, checking camera traps now emptied of poachers' shadows. The forest was returning to itself, scarred but healing. And so was he. Marin began to visit more frequently, not just to check on Birch now gone, but to linger. She brought meals sometimes, small things, venison stew, cornbread wrapped in a towel, coffee that somehow always tasted better when she made it. Her presence softened the silence in Clint's cabin. The sharp edges of old wounds dulled in her company. One crisp morning, as the sun filtered gold through the fog. She arrived with news. "I found a place," she said, pushing her braid over one shoulder, just off Mill Creek Road, an old ranger's outpost, barely used, needs work, but it's got space for kennels and a treatment room. Clint raised a brow. "You're staying. I think I always meant to. I just didn't know until now." She smiled, not the tight, professional one she used in town, but the rare, softer version Clint remembered from younger days. This place still has wild in it. People here forget how to listen. Maybe I can help them remember. Clint nodded slowly. "You won't be the only one." That afternoon, Clint returned to the old tool shed. It stood empty now, swept clean, the blankets gone. Still, he opened the door each morning. A habit, a gesture, a memory of what had once lived there. Then, exactly 1 month after Birch's death, he opened his door to find something strange on the porch. A fresh rabbit, laid carefully on the wooden boards, not mangled or chewed, but placed intact, as if it were an offering. He looked up. Shadow stood a dozen yards away, half shrouded by mist. Luna sat beside her, regal now, her adult form sleek and strong. Clint's breath caught in his throat. He stepped forward slowly. "Thank you," he said. Shadow dipped her head, then turned and vanished silently into the trees. Luna followed, her steps deliberate, powerful. There was no sound, only the wind through the high canopy, whispering above like a song remembered from childhood. that night. Clint didn't light the fire. He stood outside for hours, coat drawn tight, eyes following the stars as they pierced the black velvet sky. The world was bigger than grief, he realized, wider than silence. It held space for everything sorrow, redemption, healing, in the months that followed. Clint worked with Maren on her new clinic. He helped build the fences, hauled lumber, carved signs by hand. She called it the Hollow Creek Wildlife Center, a name they chose together. Rooted in the land's history, locals came hesitantly at first, then more regularly. Injured owls, lost fawns, abandoned house pets. Maren healed what she could. Clint, when asked, spoke gently to children about the forest, how it gives, how it remembers. He never spoke of Birch to anyone but Maren, and never aloud. But sometimes, at dusk, when the wind swept through the redwoods and the light turned the clearing to bronze, he would catch a glimpse, just a flicker of tawny fur slipping through the trees, a chirp like a whisper, and he would know they hadn't forgotten. Sometimes, miracles don't come in lightning or thunder, they come in the quiet eyes of a wounded creature, in the stillness of the forest, in a single act of trust between the wild and the human heart. Clint didn't set out to be a hero. He simply listened when the world asked him to care, and in that act of love, he discovered something divine, that God often speaks not through words, but through the lives we're given a chance to protect. This story reminds us that no matter how broken we feel, how far we've wandered, there is always a way back through grace, through compassion, and through the sacred connection between all living things. In every forest path, every act of kindness, His presence lives. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us how it moved you. Type Amen if you believe that God still works through the quiet moments, through unexpected friendships, and through second chances. Subscribe for more stories that remind us the world is still full of wonder, if only we pause long enough to see it. May God bless you and guide your steps just as He guided Clint's beneath the eternal canopy.